In the heart of London, amidst the clatter of the London Stock Exchange and the cries of street vendors, a group of men gathered in a room with high-ceilinged windows overlooking the bustling streets below. Here, far from the shores of Canton, another kind of negotiation was about to unfold, one that would mirror the intricate dance of trade taking place thousands of miles away. These men, the directors of the British East India Company, sat around a table covered in ledgers and maps. Their faces, etched with the lines of men who had made fortunes and lost them in the ebb and flow of trade, were creased with concern. Before them lay the financial health of an empire, and it was bleeding silver at an alarming rate. The balance sheets documenting the trade with China were laid out on the table like battle plans. Every figure, every entry was a testament to the steady drain on Britain's resources. It wasn't just money that was leaving Britain, it was power. With each shipment of silver, Britain was giving up a piece of its dominance to China. The figures didn't lie, and they painted a bleak picture. The company was losing heavily on trade with China. The Chinese, with their seemingly insatiable demand for silver, were turning the tables on the British, forcing them to pay more and more for the privilege of trading with the Middle Kingdom. It was a situation that couldn't continue. The British needed a solution, and they were willing to do whatever it took to find one. Amidst the clutter of papers, a map caught the eye of one of the directors. His gaze, sharp and calculating, rested on the sprawling coastline of China, his finger tracing the winding course of the Yangtze River. A few key ports along this river, he knew, held the key to China's riches. Nanjing, with its long history as a trading center, and Shanghai, with its burgeoning commercial interests, were potential game-changers. If they could find a way to access these markets, perhaps they could turn the tables on the Chinese. The idea was audacious, even reckless, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The directors decided to throw caution to the winds. They would send a mission to China, not to bow before the emperor in Canton, but to find an alternative route to China's wealth. This was no ordinary mission. This was a foray into the unknown, a gamble on the very future of the company. With a mix of trepidation and hope, they dispatched their agents, unaware that they were about to set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the course of history. The Yangtze River in the early 1800s was a busy thoroughfare, a watery highway that carried the riches of China's interior to the waiting ships in coastal ports. On a typical day, the river would teem with activity. Merchant vessels, their hulls laden with silks, porcelains, and teas, would glide upstream, their sails billowing in the soft river breeze. Downstream, the current would carry junks laden with silver, the lifeblood of China's foreign trade, toward the waiting seagoing vessels that would carry them to Canton. Along the river banks, the sounds of industry would mingle with the cries of merchants. In cities like Nanjing, warehouses would hum with the activity of workers sorting and storing goods, while in smaller towns, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer would echo across the water. But amid this familiar scene, a new element was about to emerge, an unwelcome guest that would disrupt the ancient rhythms of the river. The British mission arrived in China in the early 1800s, bearing gifts and proposals that were politely received, but ultimately rejected by Chinese officials. The message was clear: the Chinese were content with the status quo. They saw no need to alter the established trade practices that had served them well for centuries. The river, with its well-worn paths and predictable currents, was a metaphor for the Chinese way of doing business. They had no interest in the British proposal to establish new trading posts along the Yangtze, a suggestion that threatened to disrupt the carefully balanced system they had in place. To the Chinese, the river was a well-oiled machine, moving smoothly along its established course. Any attempt to divert its flow could only lead to chaos and instability. The British, however, were not ones to accept defeat gracefully. The rejection of their proposals only fueled their determination to find a way into China's lucrative markets. And so began a series of clandestine meetings and secret negotiations, all aimed at achieving the same goal: to find a way to crack open China's tightly sealed markets. In the dim oil lamplight of Canton trading houses, deals were struck and plans hatched. The river, with its constant movement and hidden depths, became the perfect setting for these clandestine activities. The stillness of the night was broken only by the lapping of waves against the hull of anchored ships and the hushed voices of men engaged in high-stakes negotiations. The Chinese, wary but intrigued, kept a close watch on these developments. The river, with its many tributaries and hidden coves, was their domain. They knew its twists and turns as well as the palms of their own hands. They were acutely aware that any deviation from the established order could spell disaster. As the plot thickened and tensions rose, the river became a silent witness to the drama unfolding on its banks. The clash between two cultures, two ways of doing business, was played out against the backdrop of a timeless landscape. The British, with their relentless determination, and the Chinese, with their deep-rooted traditions, were locked in a struggle that neither side was willing to back down from. The river, with its placid surface and hidden currents, flowed on, carrying with it the hopes, fears, and ambitions of two worlds. The fate of empires hung in the balance, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of both. The arrival of the British on the Chinese coast was not a sudden event, but the culmination of decades of simmering discontent. The restrictions placed on their trading activities in Canton, the outflow of silver, and the humiliating kowtow rituals were all symptoms of a deeper malaise. The British viewed the Chinese with a mixture of fascination and contempt. They marveled at the country's wealth and sophistication, yet dismissed its traditions and customs as backward and barbaric. The Chinese, in turn, saw the British as brash, aggressive newcomers who threatened the stability of their world. This cultural chasm, this inability to see beyond one's own perspective, was the fault line that ran through the relationship between the two nations. It was a powder keg waiting to explode, and when it did, the consequences would be catastrophic. In the ensuing conflict, reason and rationality were the first casualties. The atrocities committed by both sides, the burning of palaces, the mass killings, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, were not aberrations, but logical extensions of their respective worldviews. The British, driven by a sense of superiority and a desire for dominance, justified their actions as necessary to subdue a supposedly inferior race. The Chinese, fighting to preserve their way of life, saw the British as invaders who had to be expelled at any cost. The river, once a symbol of China's prosperity, became a battleground. The serene waters were marred by the sight of burning junks and the stench of death and decay. The rhythm of the river was replaced by the discordant notes of war drums and the cacophony of battle. The serenity of the Yangtze was shattered. As the dust settled on the Opium War and the smoke cleared from the battlefields, the river bore witness to the profound changes that had befallen China. The treaty that ended the war was a humiliating defeat for the Chinese. They were forced to open more ports to foreign trade, cede Hong Kong to the British, and pay a hefty indemnity. The river, once a symbol of China's strength and prosperity, now represented its humiliation and weakness. The influx of foreign goods into China through the newly opened ports disrupted the balance of trade that had existed for centuries. Chinese artisans, unable to compete with the cheap European manufactured goods, watched their businesses crumble. The river, which had once carried the products of Chinese ingenuity to distant lands, now carried the debris of a shattered economy. The indemnity payments to Britain drained the Chinese treasury, weakening its ability to defend itself and protect its interests. The river, which had borne the weight of China's riches, now carried the burden of its debt. And then there was opium. The war had seen a massive influx of the drug into China, leading to widespread addiction and social disintegration. Families were torn apart, communities were decimated, and the fabric of Chinese society was rent. The river, which had flowed serenely through China's heartland, now flowed with the anguish and despair of a nation lost to addiction. As we conclude our journey tonight, allow us to remind you that the river still flows. The Yangtze, with its silent wisdom, continues to wind its way through the heart of China. Its waters still bear witness to the triumphs and tragedies of the Chinese people. And though the scars of the Opium War may run deep, they are not irreparable. Just as the river carves through rock over centuries, the Chinese spirit of resilience and renewal remains unbroken. The Opium Wars may have left deep scars on the landscape of 19th century China, but the resilience of its people and the enduring spirit of its culture ensured that the river continued to flow, carrying with it the promise of a new dawn. The future, like the river, was uncertain, filled with both challenges and opportunities. But one thing was clear: China would never be the same again. The wars had been a crucible from which a transformed China would eventually emerge. This is a story of how and why the Chinese became addicted to opium. Part 1. The Solution. When it came, it arrived not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual shift in trading patterns. Opium, produced in the British territories of Bengal and Malwa in India, had been a minor component of the China trade for decades. Chinese merchants had always shown some interest in the drug, which was used both medicinally and recreationally among certain segments of the population. Initially, the opium trade was small and carefully regulated. The East India Company sold opium at auction in Calcutta to private traders, who then transported it to China. These private traders, known as country traders, operated independently of the company's official tea trade, creating a useful separation between legitimate commerce and the increasingly controversial opium business. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. In 1800, approximately 4,000 chests of opium entered China annually. By 1820, this number had grown to 5,000 chests. Each chest contained roughly 140 pounds of processed opium, representing months of cultivation, processing and transport from the poppy fields of India. The British traders who handled this commerce were not the swashbuckling adventurers of popular imagination, but careful businessmen who approached their work with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all aspects of the Canton trade. They maintained detailed records, established regular shipping schedules, and developed networks of Chinese distributors who could move the product inland with minimal disruption to the established order. William Jardine and James Matheson, two Scottish traders who would later establish one of the most successful opium trading firms, exemplified this approach. They were not motivated by adventure or ideology, but by the simple recognition that opium represented the only British product for which there was substantial Chinese demand. Their correspondence, preserved in company archives, reads like the letters of any merchants, discussions of prices, shipping schedules, and market conditions, all conducted in the measured language of commercial routine. The expansion of demand as the 1820s progressed, the demand for opium in China began to grow with the steady persistence of a rising tide. This growth was not sudden or dramatic, but followed the gradual patterns that characterize all significant social changes. Chinese consumers, initially concentrated in the coastal trading cities, slowly introduced the drug to inland communities through networks of family and business connections. The process was remarkably similar to the spread of tea drinking in Britain during the previous century. What began as an exotic luxury gradually became a common habit, then an expected part of daily routine for increasing numbers of people. Chinese opium smokers developed their own rituals and customs around the drug's use, creating specialized pipes, lamps, and smoking implements with the same attention to craftsmanship that characterized all Chinese material culture. By 1830, approximately 18,000 chests of opium were entering China annually, a fourfold increase from the beginning of the century. This growth represented not just increased consumption, but the development of a sophisticated distribution network that reached deep into the Chinese interior. Opium moved along the same trade routes that carried tea, silk, and porcelain, transported by the same merchants who had been moving goods through China for generations. The British traders observed this growth with the satisfaction of merchants whose products had found their market. Their letters home spoke of expanding opportunities and favorable market conditions, in the same terms they might use to describe the tea trade. The moral implications of their commerce were rarely discussed in their correspondence, not from any particular callousness, but because the trade had developed so gradually that it seemed as natural and inevitable as any other form of commerce. Chinese official responses: the slow recognition of a problem. The Chinese government, as response to the growing opium trade, followed the measured pace that characterized all imperial decision-making. Local officials in Canton had been aware of the trade for years, but had generally treated it as a minor administrative matter, similar to the regulation of any other imported commodity. The first serious discussions of opium as a policy issue began in the mid-1820s, when provincial governors started reporting increased opium use among government employees and military personnel. These reports moved through the imperial bureaucracy with the deliberate pace of all official communications, passing from local magistrates to provincial governors, then to the Board of Revenue in Beijing, and finally to the emperor himself. The Daoguang Emperor, who had ascended to the throne in 1820, was a conscientious ruler who approached all policy matters with careful deliberation. His initial response to reports about opium was to request additional information, detailed studies of the trade scope, its effects on Chinese society, and the feasibility of various regulatory approaches. These studies, conducted by teams of imperial scholars and administrators, proceeded with the thoroughness that characterized all Chinese bureaucratic investigations. Officials interviewed merchants, examined customs records, and consulted historical precedents for dealing with similar problems. Their reports, written in the formal language of imperial administration, painted a picture of gradual but significant social change. The most influential of these reports came from Huang Juezi, a Hamlin Academy scholar who had been tasked with conducting a comprehensive review of the opium situation. His memorial to the emperor, submitted in 1838, read like an academic treatise rather than an urgent policy recommendation. Huang methodically examined the trade's economic impact, its social consequences, and the various options available to the imperial government. He noted the growing number of opium smokers, the negative effects on the Chinese economy, and the difficulty of stopping the trade due to the involvement of foreign merchants. However, he ultimately concluded that the problem was not opium itself, but the failure of Chinese merchants to observe traditional commercial ethics. According to Huang, the solution was not to ban opium, but to remind Chinese merchants of their moral obligations and to encourage them to end the trade voluntarily. He recommended a series of administrative measures to limit opium imports, such as raising import taxes and requiring licenses for opium merchants. But he ultimately left the success of these measures up to the virtuous conduct of Chinese merchants. The emperor accepted Huang's recommendations and issued a series of edicts aimed at curbing the opium trade. These edicts, however, were not the sweeping reforms that many Chinese observers had hoped for. They did not, for example, ban opium outright or expel foreign merchants from Chinese ports. Instead, they reaffirmed traditional Chinese values and urged merchants to end the opium trade voluntarily. The emperor also ordered the construction of several opium factories to provide Chinese addicts with a cheaper, domestically produced alternative to imported opium. However, these factories were not economically viable and produced a low-quality opium that was unpopular with Chinese smokers. The Chinese government's response to opium was ultimately a failure. The gradual nature of its policies allowed the opium trade to continue growing and eventually overwhelm the Chinese economy. The Chinese inability to stop the opium trade was not due to any lack of effort or resolve, but the result of the complex social, economic, and political forces that had been transforming China for decades. The opium trade had developed gradually, and its effects had been felt unevenly across Chinese society. While some Chinese merchants and officials had profited from the trade, others had suffered its negative consequences. For example, opium had contributed to the decline of China's silver reserves and the devaluation of its currency. It had also led to widespread addiction and social disorder in many coastal cities. Despite these problems, the Chinese government had been unable to stop the opium trade because it had developed so gradually that it had gone unnoticed or misunderstood for most of the 19th century. The government's slow response to the crisis allowed the opium trade to grow and eventually become the major problem that it was by the 1860s. In addition, the Chinese government's efforts to regulate the opium trade had been hampered by the lack of a clear understanding of its causes and consequences. The government had not realized until relatively late in the century that opium addiction was not simply a moral failing, but a complex social issue caused by a variety of factors. Finally, the Chinese government's attempts to curb the opium trade had been complicated by its efforts to maintain good relations with the British and other Western powers. The government had been reluctant to take measures that might provoke the Westerners or damage the Chinese economy. The result had been a series of half measures that had failed to stop the opium trade and instead allowed it to grow unchecked. The Opium War is one of those conflicts everyone has heard about, but few people really know much beyond the basic outline. It is a story usually told as a straightforward clash between an enlightened West and a decadent East, where the Chinese rulers are portrayed as backwards and corrupt, and the British as modern and progressive. It is a narrative that finds echoes in the classic Western histories of the war, which tend to emphasize the backwardness of Chinese society and the superiority of British civilization. But this familiar story has been seriously challenged in recent decades. A new generation of historians has produced sophisticated studies that complicate our understanding of the conflict's causes and consequences, demonstrating that the Opium War was a far more complex and nuanced event than previous scholarship had allowed. This course will explore the early stages of that conflict, focusing on the events leading up to the outbreak of hostilities in 1839. We will examine how the British and Chinese came to be at war, why the war began in the way that it did, and how it quickly escalated into a full-blown international crisis. We will begin with the efforts of Chinese officials to regulate the opium trade in the 1830s, and we will follow the dramatic escalation in Anglo-Chinese relations through the events leading up to the First Opium War. This is the first episode of a multi-part series. In 1838, the Chinese government dispatched a series of special commissioners to investigate the opium trade in the southern provinces, with instructions to end the growing menace as quickly as possible. The commissioners, along with their staffs, fanned out across Guangdong, Jiangxi, and Fujian, carrying out a series of investigations that would reveal the extent of Chinese involvement in the opium trade. The results of these investigations were disturbing. The officials discovered that opium dens were operating openly in major cities, and that even some members of the imperial bureaucracy were involved in smuggling. The most shocking revelation was the extent of Chinese financing for the opium trade. The officials discovered that Chinese merchants were purchasing large quantities of opium on credit, promising to repay their debts when the cargo was resold in China. This practice meant that the Chinese, not the British, effectively controlled the flow of opium into the country and reaped the profits from its sale. The commissioner's reports confirmed what many in the Chinese leadership had long suspected, that the opium trade was a much more serious threat to Chinese society than previously believed. The sheer volume of opium being consumed, the social corruption it was causing, and the extent of Chinese financial and commercial involvement all indicated that the existing policies of tolerance and non-interference were no longer viable options. Something had to be done, and so began the latest official effort to deal with the opium problem. But this time was different. These investigators were given clear instructions to be tough, with one commissioner reporting that his superiors wanted results and were prepared to take drastic measures. So rather than merely documenting the opium problem, these officials set about solving it. Acting on the orders of their superiors, they began shutting down opium dens, arresting smugglers and confiscating illicit stocks of opium. Their actions quickly made them very unpopular with large segments of the Chinese population. The opium trade was deeply entrenched in southern Chinese society, with opium dens on nearly every street corner and opium pipes in every home. When the authorities began cracking down on this trade, they were met with open hostility. Chinese officials were beaten and killed. Their property was destroyed, and their efforts to enforce the law were simply ignored. By mid-1838, it was clear that a crackdown alone would not solve the opium problem. The officials requested permission to try a new approach, one that would have a profound impact on the future of Chinese-Western relations. Wang Zhuezi's report sparked what became known as the Great Debate, a series of policy discussions that unfolded over months in the halls of the Forbidden City. The debate centered on how the Chinese government should respond to the opium trade. Should it continue to do nothing? Should it crack down on opium smugglers? Or should it seek to regulate and legalize the opium trade? The participants in the Great Debate were among the most learned and experienced officials in the Chinese bureaucracy. They represented a variety of viewpoints and interests within the government, but they all shared a deep commitment to the principles of Confucian statecraft. The debate proceeded with the careful deliberation that characterized all imperial decision-making, with officials presenting detailed arguments for various approaches to the opium problem. One faction, led by Su Naji, argued for legalization and regulation. Their position was based on practical considerations rather than moral approval of opium use. They pointed out that prohibition had proven ineffective, that the trade continued to grow despite official disapproval, and that legalization would at least allow the government to collect taxes on opium imports while regulating its distribution. Su Naji's arguments were presented in a series of carefully reasoned memorials that read like economic treatises. He calculated the potential tax revenue from legalized opium trade, estimated the costs of enforcement under a prohibition regime, and examined precedents from Chinese history for dealing with similar regulatory challenges. His approach was that of a practical administrator seeking the most efficient solution to a complex problem. The opposing faction, led by Lin Zexu, argued for strict prohibition and aggressive enforcement. Lin's position was based on both moral and practical considerations. He viewed opium as a corrupting influence on Chinese society and believed that decisive action could eliminate the trade entirely. His memorials to the emperor were written in the elevated language of Confucian moral philosophy, but they also contained detailed practical proposals for enforcement. Lin Zexu was not a firebrand or an ideologue, but a highly experienced administrator who had served successfully in various provincial posts. His approach to the opium problem reflected the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his earlier work. He proposed a comprehensive enforcement strategy that would target both foreign suppliers and Chinese distributors, with carefully graduated penalties designed to deter participation in the trade. The debate between these two approaches continued for months, with officials presenting increasingly detailed analyses of the costs and benefits of each strategy. The emperor himself participated in these discussions, requesting additional information and clarification on specific points. The process resembled an extended academic seminar more than a crisis response, with each participant contributing scholarly analyses of various aspects of the problem. In late 1838, the Daejeongung Emperor reached his decision after months of careful deliberation. He concluded that the opium trade represented a serious threat to Chinese society, and that decisive action was necessary to eliminate it. His choice of Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner to Canton reflected his commitment to a policy of strict prohibition and aggressive enforcement. Lin Zexu's appointment was announced through the standard imperial channels, with official proclamations distributed to provincial governors and local magistrates throughout the empire. The language of these proclamations was formal and measured, emphasizing the emperor's determination to address the opium problem through established legal and administrative procedures. Lin himself received his appointment with the gravity appropriate to such a significant responsibility. His preparations for the Canton mission were thorough and methodical, involving months of study and consultation with experts on foreign trade and maritime law. He assembled a staff of experienced administrators and legal scholars and developed detailed plans for implementing the emperor's anti-opium policy. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton on March 10, 1839, traveling by the imperial courier system that connected Beijing to the southern provinces. His journey had taken several weeks, following the Grand Canal north to south, then overland through the mountainous regions of central China, and finally by riverboat down the Pearl River to Canton itself. The commissioner's arrival was marked by the formal ceremonies that accompanied all high-level imperial appointments. Local officials gathered at the city gates to receive him, dressed in their finest court robes and arranged according to strict protocols of rank and precedence. The procession that escorted Lin to his official residence moved with the measured pace of imperial ceremony, each participant aware of their role in representing the dignity and authority of the Qing dynasty. Lin's first official act was to establish his headquarters in the former residence of the provincial governor, a compound of traditional Chinese buildings arranged around courtyards filled with carefully tended gardens. The buildings themselves reflected the ordered hierarchy of Chinese administration, reception halls for meeting with subordinates, private studies for reviewing documents, and ceremonial spaces for conducting official business with foreign representatives. Lin Zexu's first priority was to develop a comprehensive understanding of the opium trade's structure and operations. This investigation proceeded with the thoroughness of a scholarly research project, involving interviews with Chinese merchants, examination of customs records, and careful analysis of foreign trading patterns. The commissioner's staff compiled detailed dossiers on the major foreign trading firms, including Jardine, Matheson & Company, Dent & Company, and the various American and continental European houses. These dossiers read like academic studies, with careful analysis of each firm's business practices, financial resources, and key personnel. Lin was particularly interested in understanding the relationship between the official tea trade, conducted under the auspices of the East India Company, and the private opium trade carried on by independent merchants. His investigation revealed the complex web of financial relationships that connected these supposedly separate activities, how opium profits financed tea purchases, how the same ships often carried both commodities, and how the same Chinese merchants frequently dealt in both legal and illegal goods. The commissioner also studied the technical aspects of opium production and distribution. His staff prepared detailed reports on the cultivation of opium poppies in India, the processing of raw opium into the refined products sold in China, and the transportation networks that moved the drug from Indian ports to Chinese consumers. These reports were written in the precise language of administrative analysis, treating opium as they might any other commodity subject to government regulation. Perhaps most importantly, Lin sought to understand the scale of Chinese involvement in the opium trade. His investigation revealed that the trade could not function without extensive Chinese participation, not just the Kohong merchants who officially facilitated all foreign commerce, but also a vast network of distributors, transporters, and retailers who moved opium from the coastal trading posts to consumers throughout the empire. The British traders in Canton learned of Lin's appointment through their usual intelligence networks, Chinese merchants who maintained contacts in the imperial bureaucracy, and Portuguese officials in Macau who had access to government communications. The initial British response was one of concern rather than alarm. They had dealt with Chinese officials before and assumed that Lin's mission would follow the usual pattern of imperial assignments, formal pronouncements followed by gradual accommodation to practical realities. This assumption would prove to be a significant miscalculation. Lin Zexu was not a typical Chinese official, and his approach to the opium problem would be far more direct and uncompromising than the British traders anticipated. This has been the first episode of a multi-part series on the origins of the Opium War. To watch the next episode, click here. To see the rest of the episodes in this series, please visit our channel. The Anglo-Chinese Dictionary, a work whose main purpose was to facilitate the exchange of useful knowledge between the two nations. In other words, opium is bad and we don't like it, and we are telling you so that you can stop sending it here. It's really that simple. Of course, this didn't happen, which is why you're watching this video right now. But what happened when Lin Zexu seized on this idea? Did it succeed? Did the Chinese win? Well, in the short term, no, they did not. But in the longer term, yes, they did. So let's talk about that. This is the first episode of a series on the Opium Wars. Lin Zexu is a fascinating character in Chinese history. His biography is a fascinating read. If you want to know more about him, I encourage you to check it out. However, for our purposes today, we will focus on his mission to end the opium trade. And to do that, he had a secret weapon, which was his ability to write very good letters. Let me explain. One of Lin Zexu's first decisions once he took office was to write directly to Queen Victoria. You know, that famous British queen that everybody knows. He explained the Chinese position on the opium trade and requested British cooperation in eliminating it. The letter was extraordinary because it was one of the first times the Chinese court had written directly to the British monarch rather than communicating through established diplomatic channels. This was bold because it represented a departure from long-standing diplomatic conventions that dictated how the two governments should interact. At the time, the British and Chinese empires communicated through an established network of diplomatic agents and interpreters. Official correspondence followed strict protocols and went through established diplomatic channels. Direct communication between the two monarchs was virtually unheard of and certainly highly unusual. But Lin Zexu was not concerned with diplomatic niceties. He knew that the opium trade was a major problem for China, and he wanted to resolve it quickly. He also knew that Britain was complicit in the trade, and that the only way to stop it was to appeal directly to the British monarch. Lin's letter was powerful. It combined moral arguments against the opium trade with practical considerations for British cooperation. In the letter, Lin described the destructive effects of opium on Chinese society and emphasized the need for Britain to honor its commitments under international law to suppress the trade. He also noted that many British merchants were already complying with Chinese regulations on opium and urged the Queen to encourage her subjects to follow suit. The letter was carefully worded to appeal to British sensibilities, and it worked. Upon receiving the letter, Queen Victoria was deeply troubled by the situation in China, and she ordered her Foreign Office to respond accordingly. The Foreign Office took the matter seriously and drafted a detailed reply to Lin Zexu, urging British merchants to comply with Chinese regulations on opium. However, there was one small problem. None of this actually happened. The letter never got to Victoria, and her Foreign Office never responded to it. The reason for this was simple. The letter was never delivered. Lin's staff translated the letter into English and transmitted it to Queen Victoria through the British trading community in Canton. However, it never reached its intended recipient. British diplomatic protocol required that all communications with the Crown be channeled through the Foreign Office, and the letter was intercepted and filed away by British officials in Canton, who had no authority to forward it to London. Nevertheless, Lin's attempt to communicate directly with the British monarch was an important moment in Anglo-Chinese relations. While the letter never reached Victoria, the fact that Lin was willing to bypass diplomatic channels and appeal directly to the British monarch demonstrated the seriousness with which he viewed the opium issue. It was a bold move that foreshadowed the confrontational approach he would take in dealing with the British. So let's fast forward a bit. After writing the letter to the Queen, Lin Zexu began preparing for his crackdown on the opium trade. He studied Western legal texts, consulted with Chinese scholars, and developed a comprehensive understanding of the issues involved in the trade. His research revealed that opium was illegal in Britain itself, and that British merchants were prohibited from selling opium in China because it was harmful to the health of the Chinese people and contrary to Chinese law. Lin decided to use this information as the basis for his campaign against opium. When he launched his crackdown in March of 1839, Lin Zexu issued a formal ultimatum to the foreign trading community, demanding the surrender of all opium stocks in their possession and a written pledge to cease all future opium trading. The ultimatum was a bold move that demonstrated Lin's commitment to ending the opium trade once and for all. There was little precedent for such a strong-willed action in the history of the Canton trade. For decades, Chinese officials had often issued stern proclamations about various trading practices, only to quietly allow business to continue as usual after appropriate face-saving measures had been taken. But Lin was not interested in making empty threats. He was determined to end the opium trade, and he was prepared to use force to do it. The ultimatum caught the foreign traders off guard, and they resisted fiercely. They argued that opium was legal in their home countries, and that they should be free to sell it in China. They also claimed that they had diplomatic immunity, and that the Chinese government had no right to interfere with their activities. However, Lin was not intimidated by their arguments. He had studied Western legal principles carefully, and he was confident that he had a strong case against the traders. He argued that opium was illegal in Britain and that British merchants should not be permitted to sell in China products that were prohibited in their own country. He also rejected the claim of diplomatic immunity, arguing that it did not apply to private merchants. The ultimatum created a major crisis in Anglo-Chinese relations and set the stage for the Opium War, while the British government eventually agreed to negotiate with the Chinese on the opium issue. The war would ultimately result in a humiliating defeat for China and the entrenchment of Western dominance in Asia. Nevertheless, Lin's efforts to end the opium trade were an important step in the history of Anglo-Chinese relations, and his legacy as a national hero continues to this day. So there you have it, the story of Lin Zexu's opium ultimatum to the British and the subsequent events that led to the Opium Wars. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay up to date on all my latest content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.
The Forbidden City, a lavish palace complex in the heart of Beijing, is open to the public as a museum today. But in the 19th century, only a select few were granted access to its ornate halls and courtyards. One such individual was Lin Zexu, a mid-level official who would use his access to influence the most important event in Sino-Western relations up to that point, the First Opium War. Through his shrewd political maneuvering and single-minded focus on eliminating the opium trade, Lin became the Governor-General of the Canton region, a post that gave him control over trade with Western powers. Once in office, Lin faced a critical decision: how to deal with the growing problem of opium smuggling. Most officials wanted to ignore the issue or take small-scale measures to curb the flow of opium, but Lin knew that something more drastic was needed. So he hatched a plan to destroy the opium seized from smugglers, sending a powerful message to both the Chinese people and the Western powers who profited from the trade. What followed was one of the most carefully orchestrated public ceremonies in Chinese administrative history. Lin Zexu approached this task with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized all aspects of his mission. Recognizing that the destruction needed to serve both practical and symbolic purposes, the location chosen for the destruction was Human, also known as the Bogue, a strategic point where the Pearl River narrowed before flowing into the South China Sea. This site was selected for both practical and symbolic reasons. It was easily defensible, accessible to Chinese officials and foreign observers, and historically significant as the gateway between China and the outside world. The location of the destruction was thus not merely accidental, but carefully selected to maximize its impact. Before starting the construction, Lin's staff spent weeks preparing the destruction site. They constructed a series of large pools where the opium would be dissolved and then flushed into the sea. Chinese engineers calculated that each pool could process approximately 100 chests of opium per day, meaning that the entire destruction process would require several months to complete. The pools themselves were rectangular excavations, approximately 150 feet long and 75 feet wide, lined with stone and equipped with drainage channels that led directly to the river. To ensure that the opium was completely neutralized, Chinese scientists mixed the opium with a solution of salt water and lime, which created a substance that was no longer addictive. On June 3, 1839, the grand ceremony began. Lin Zexu, dressed in his full court robes, presided over the opening ceremonies, accompanied by the senior officials of his staff. Local magistrates, military commanders, and representatives of the Kohong merchants were also present, creating an assembly that represented all levels of Chinese authority. Foreign observers were specifically invited to witness the destruction, reflecting Lin's desire to ensure that the international community understood the seriousness of Chinese intentions. In attendance were British, American, and Portuguese representatives, as well as missionaries and other Western residents of the Canton area. Among them was Captain Elliot, the British consul, who would later become a key figure in the conflict over China's opium policies. After all, officials were assembled. The ceremony commenced with traditional Chinese rituals designed to purify the site and invoke divine blessing for the proceedings. Incense was burned. Prayers were offered to the ancestors, and formal proclamations were read explaining the purpose and significance of the destruction. These rituals served to frame the opium destruction not simply as a law enforcement action, but as a moral and spiritual cleansing of Chinese territory. With the rituals concluded, the real work of destruction began. Chinese workers, supervised by imperial officials, carefully removed the opium from its containers and placed it in the prepared pools. Each chest was opened with deliberate ceremony, and its contents were measured and recorded before being added to the dissolution mixture. The visual impact of the destruction was carefully calculated for maximum effect. As the opium dissolved in the salt water and lime mixture, it created a dark, viscous liquid that was clearly visible to all observers. The pools gradually filled with this mixture, creating a stark visual representation of the scale of the opium trade and the determination of Chinese authorities to eliminate it. For the next 23 days, the destruction of 20,000 chests of opium proceeded according to a carefully organized daily routine. Each morning, Chinese workers would arrive at the human site and begin the systematic process of opening chests, dissolving opium, and flushing the resulting mixture into the Pearl River. The work was conducted under the close supervision of imperial officials, maintained detailed records of each day's activities. These records included the number of chests processed, the weight of opium destroyed, and observations about the effectiveness of the destruction method. The bureaucratic thoroughness of these records reflected the Chinese approach to all significant administrative undertakings. Foreign observers were permitted to visit the destruction site daily, and many kept their own records of the proceedings. These foreign accounts provide valuable insights into Chinese administrative methods and the impressive scale of the destruction operation. British merchant William Hunter described the process as conducted with a degree of order and regularity that would have done credit to any European administration. As the ceremony reached its midpoint, a sense of urgency began to grip the participants. Time was of the essence, and every effort was made to expedite the destruction process without sacrificing its solemnity and effectiveness. The intense pressure to complete the task as quickly as possible stemmed from multiple sources. Firstly, Lin Zexu was eager to demonstrate the efficiency and capability of the Chinese bureaucracy to both domestic and foreign observers. Completing the destruction within a relatively short time frame would showcase the power and organization of the Qing government and serve as a warning to those who sought to challenge its authority. Secondly, there were practical considerations related to the logistics of the operation. Maintaining the elaborate infrastructure of pools, drainage channels, and worker housing required significant resources. Additionally, the presence of foreign observers and the need to keep the site secure necessitated a large contingent of guards and administrators. By completing the destruction as quickly as possible, the logistical burden could be reduced and the costs associated with the operation minimized. Finally, there was a strategic dimension to the time frame set for the destruction. Lin Zexu was keen to send a clear message to the British that he was in control of the situation. By completing the destruction before the arrival of the next trading fleet, he could underscore the fact that the crackdown on opium was not a temporary measure but a permanent fixture of his administration. This would serve as a warning to British merchants and the British government that any attempt to resume the opium trade would be met with swift and decisive action. As the destruction neared its conclusion, the pace quickened and the sense of urgency intensified. The final days of the operation were marked by a flurry of activity as workers, officials and foreign observers alike rushed to bring the spectacle to its dramatic close. On June 25, 1839, after 23 days of methodical destruction, the final chests of opium were dissolved and the pools were emptied into the Pearl River. The foreign observers stood shoulder to shoulder on the bank of the river, watching the last vestiges of the illicit cargo disappear into the current. A profound silence fell over the crowd as the last of the opium was flushed away. It was a moment of collective realization that the monumental task was finally complete. The air was thick with anticipation and the sense of a momentous occasion. Then, applause erupted, echoing across the river as spectators broke into spontaneous cheers and applause. The sound carried on the wind, a testament to the magnitude of the achievement. In his closing address, Lin Zexu declared that the destruction represented not an end, but a beginning. The start of a new era in which foreign trade with China would be conducted according to Chinese law and Chinese moral standards. He announced new regulations that would govern future foreign commerce, including requirements for written bonds pledging not to import opium and severe penalties for any violations. The assembled foreigners listened intently as Lin's words resonated with the gravity of the moment. The destruction of the opium was not just a display of power. It was a defining moment in the relationship between China and the West. In the aftermath of the destruction ceremony, foreign reactions were mixed. Some Western observers, particularly the missionaries, viewed the destruction as a necessary evil to protect the health and well-being of the Chinese people. They recognized the social and moral devastation caused by opium addiction and supported the Chinese government's efforts to eradicate the trade. On the other hand, British merchants and officials, particularly those involved in the opium trade, saw the destruction as a grave threat to their economic interests. They viewed the confiscation and destruction of their property as a violation of international law and a dangerous escalation of the conflict. The British government in London was deeply concerned by the implications of the destruction. Officials recognized that the seizure and destruction of British opium represented a significant shift in the conflict with China. They understood that Lin Zexu's actions had not only eliminated a substantial quantity of the illicit cargo, but also sent a clear message to the international community. As the news of the destruction reached London, policymakers grappled with how to respond. Some advocated for peaceful negotiations and diplomatic solutions, while others argued for a more confrontational approach. Ultimately, the British government decided to take a hard line, viewing the destruction as a challenge to British sovereignty and economic interests. This decision would have profound consequences, setting in motion the events that led to the First Opium War. The destruction of opium at Human was more than just an administrative action. It was a defining moment in the relationship between China and the West. It symbolized the clash of cultures, values, and worldviews that would shape the 19th century. The event highlighted the challenges of intercultural communication, the complexities of international relations, and the unintended consequences of seemingly isolated actions. Understanding the motivations and perspectives of the key players involved in the destruction provides valuable insights into the dynamics of this pivotal historical event. Lin Zexu, the Chinese official who orchestrated the destruction, was driven by a deep sense of duty and a commitment to upholding Chinese law and morality. He genuinely believed that he was protecting his country and its people from the scourge of opium addiction. His actions were not merely a display of power or an attempt to humiliate the British, but a sincere effort to safeguard the well-being of the Chinese populace. On the other hand, the British perspective was shaped by the economic interests and worldview of the 19th century capitalist society. For the British merchants and officials involved in the opium trade, the seizure and destruction of their property was seen as a violation of international law and a threat to their economic prosperity. They viewed the Chinese attempts to regulate and restrict the opium trade as an infringement on their rights and an obstacle to free trade. In conclusion, The destruction of the surrendered opium by Lin Zexu stands as a pivotal moment in the history of China's interaction with the West. It was a dramatic display of Chinese power and resolve, but also a catalyst for the escalating conflict that would eventually lead to the First Opium War. By examining the event through the lens of the actors involved and their motivations, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complexities and tensions that shaped this pivotal period. Understanding the perspectives of both the Chinese and Western participants allows us to better comprehend the forces that drove their actions and the unintended consequences that followed. As we reflect on this historic event, it is essential to recognize the cultural, economic, and political factors that converged in Human in 1839. Lin Zexu's unwavering commitment to Chinese law and...
All right, let's talk about the origins of the First Opium War. If you've been following this series for a while now, you already know that this is a complicated subject. There are all kinds of twists and turns in the road that led to war between Britain and China in 1839. So we're going to try something a little different for this episode and follow one possible path to war. The path that started in China and made its way to London. And I mean physically made its way to London. Our story begins in November of 1839 when the Chinese commissioner, Lin Zexu, ordered the destruction of some 2 million pounds of opium seized in the port of Guangzhou. As news of this and other seizures spread, it was clear to those involved in the trade that something had changed in China. But it would take a few months for word to reach London. News of events in China during the 1830s was slow to arrive in Britain. Dispatches from the British consul in Guangzhou regularly took 6 months or more to reach London, and even then they were often incomplete or difficult to decipher. It wasn't until late autumn, 1839, that Londoners began to get the full story about what had happened in Guangzhou. The reports arrived in fragments. First brief dispatches from Captain Elliot describing the crisis in general terms, then more detailed accounts from merchants and missionaries, and finally comprehensive reports that included eyewitness descriptions of the destruction at Human. In total, it must have taken at least 5 months for the full story to make its way to London. But once there, it presented a serious problem for the British government. Lin Zexu's actions seemed to violate the long-standing commercial and diplomatic arrangements between China and Britain. What was the government going to do about it? Faced with this problem, the British government did what it always did. It turned to paperwork. When news of the opium seizures first arrived in London, it was reviewed by clerks in the Foreign Office. These clerks summarized the reports and drew up preliminary papers for the department's senior officials. Those officials then drafted a summary of the situation for the Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, along with recommendations about how he might proceed. This process of gradual analysis and recommendation was essential to the way the British government worked. No major policy decision was ever made quickly or without extensive consideration. All major issues were subject to the same kind of thorough review, no matter how large or small. Consultations with merchants and missionaries, as well as a variety of officials who had dealings with China, were also undertaken. William Yarrow, for example, was the head of the British East India Company's China department. He knew more about the opium trade than anyone else in Britain and was routinely consulted by the Foreign Office about matters relating to China. By the end of December 1839, Lord Palmerston had a pretty good sense of what had happened in China, what the likely consequences would be, and what his options were. The British government had 2 basic options. It could protest Lin Zexu's actions diplomatically and demand compensation for the destroyed opium, or it could take military action against the Chinese. The first option was probably too passive for Palmerston, who had a reputation for being hawkish and impulsive. But it also probably wouldn't work. The Chinese government would almost certainly reject any diplomatic protests and refuse to pay compensation. The only option left was war. Now, if you've been watching this series for a while, you already know that the Chinese didn't want war with Britain. And as far as wars go, it's a pretty safe bet that the British didn't either. But by January 1840, It looked like the two countries were headed in that direction. So we regone not take a break from our regularly scheduled programming to bring you a message from today's sponsor. Once you understand that war was on the horizon, there was only one thing left to do: prepare for war. Now, as I said before, this was a very British thing to do. Even people who disliked the war, like William Gladstone, recognized that once a war seemed inevitable, preparation was the only sensible course of action. You can learn more about this kind of preparation and how it helped shape the First Opium War by checking out my book, The First Opium War, through the link below. War with China would be a long and complicated affair. After all, China was huge and powerful, and fighting a conventional war would be extremely difficult. This meant that any British war preparations would need to be methodical and thorough. There were a lot of details to consider, like troop deployments and supply routes and naval logistics. But the British government also needed to keep an eye on public opinion. Support for war was far from universal in Britain, and the government needed to be prepared for all possibilities. That meant keeping track of public meetings, newspaper editorials, and private correspondence, so they could get a sense of how the British people felt about the war. You can learn more about this aspect of the war preparations by checking out my podcast, Opium, through the link below. To start preparing for war with China, the British government would need a lot of money. But it wasn't just the cost of the war itself that they had to worry about. They also needed to compensate British citizens for their losses in China, and those losses were substantial. Around $30 million worth of opium had been confiscated by the Chinese, and that was just the value of the opium itself. The British government also had to compensate ship owners, merchants, and missionaries who had lost property in China. Altogether, these claims came to around $50 million, which was a lot of money in the 1840s, equivalent to around $1 billion today. Raising that much money would require new taxes, and that wasn't a popular idea in Britain. But Queen Victoria and her advisors knew that they had no choice. The British government needed to make every effort to compensate British citizens for their losses in China. They also needed to show the Chinese that they were prepared to fight a long and difficult war. That meant raising new taxes and passing a war budget. By February 1840, the British government had decided on a course of action. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, would announce to Parliament that the government intended to go to war with China. This announcement would be followed by a formal declaration of war and the dispatch of British troops to China. The timing of the announcement was critical. Palmerston needed to give Parliament enough time to prepare for war, but he also needed to prevent pro-Chinese factions from gaining the upper hand. The government decided on a date in early April, which gave Parliament about 3 weeks to prepare for war. During that time, ministers met with members of Parliament to discuss the situation and build support for their plan. They also issued a formal declaration of war and began dispatching troops to China. The British decision to go to war with China was controversial. Many members of Parliament opposed the war, arguing that it was not in Britain's best interest. They also argued that the war would be costly and divisive, and that it would damage Britain's reputation abroad. But the government's supporters argued that war was necessary to protect British interests in China. They also argued that war would be relatively cheap and that it would be over quickly. The debate in Parliament was intense and at times bitter. But in the end, the government won the day. The British public was largely behind the war effort, and Parliament voted to approve the government's plan. With Parliament's approval, the British government was able to raise the funds it needed to fight the war. The government passed a war budget of around $50 million, which was equivalent to around $1 billion today. The government also began raising new taxes to pay for the war. The British government was now at war with China, and the future looked uncertain. But one thing was certain: the war would be expensive and divisive. But despite the challenges ahead, the British government was confident that it could win the war. The British military was one of the most powerful in the world, and the British economy was strong. Moreover, the British government had the support of the people. In the end, the war would last only a few years, and Britain would emerge victorious. The war would have a profound impact on both Britain and China, but that is a story for another time. The British decision to go to war with China was a major event in history. It marked the beginning of the end of Chinese isolationism, and it also marked the beginning of the Opium Wars. The First Opium War was fought between 1839 and 1842, and it resulted in a decisive Chinese victory. However, the war had a profound impact on both Britain and China. For Britain, the war marked the beginning of its decline as a global power. For China, the war marked the beginning of its transformation from a closed society into a modern nation-state. Alright, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, goodbye.
The year is 1840, and you are watching the largest naval and military expedition ever mounted up to that point in history. Sail by sail, the nearly 40 ships of the British East India Company and the Royal Navy pull out of the ports of Plymouth, Portsmouth, Bombay, and Calcutta. The massive fleet will carry 4,000 British soldiers and sailors, along with thousands more sepoys or native Indian troops, along with enough supplies and equipment to sustain them in the field for years. The goal of this expedition is to subdue the Chinese Empire, one of the largest, longest-lasting, and most powerful civilizations in world history. But why would the British want to do something so crazy? And how did they even start a war with the most populous nation in the world? Well, let's find out. Welcome to my channel. The Opium War between the British and Chinese began in 1839 after decades of escalating tensions over trade and diplomacy. The immediate trigger was the renewed Chinese crackdown on the illegal opium trade, which was damaging Chinese society and undermining Qing dynasty authority. The British government, concerned about its citizens and subjects involved in the opium trade and worried about the potential impact on British India, intervened diplomatically and militarily. Despite early diplomatic efforts, negotiations failed, and Chinese authorities detained and confiscated the property of several British subjects involved in the opium trade. On April 1840, the British launched a military expedition to force the Chinese to release the captured British and allow British ships to freely enter Chinese ports. This marked the beginning of the First Anglo-Chinese War, which would have profound implications for both nations and shape the future of Asia. The British Expeditionary Force began departing from British and Indian ports in April 1840, with ships leaving at intervals over several weeks as preparations were completed and favorable weather conditions developed. The timing of the British expedition was crucial and reflected careful planning by British authorities in London, Calcutta, and other Asian ports. Ships assembled at predetermined rendezvous points, such as Singapore and Hong Kong, where final preparations were made and last-minute intelligence was gathered about conditions in China. The British government understood the logistical challenges of coordinating such a large force across vast distances and through treacherous waters, so they made sure to plan ahead. From a modern perspective, the size of the force may seem modest, but by the standards of the time, the British expedition was truly impressive. At full strength, the British force consisted of approximately 40 ships, including warships, troop transports, and merchant vessels chartered to carry supplies and equipment. These ships represented the peak of 19th century British naval power, including some of the fastest and most heavily armed vessels in the world. Among them were several steam-powered warships, which allowed the British to maintain a significant speed advantage over their Chinese counterparts. In terms of military personnel, the expedition carried around 4,000 troops, mostly British regulars and sepoys from the British East India Company's army. This included infantry, artillery, and a small number of cavalry, as well as a few hundred Marines who were trained in amphibious warfare and would play a critical role in the British campaign. Additionally, the expedition carried several thousand support personnel, including sailors, camp followers, and civilian contractors, who provided essential services and supplies to the military forces. Altogether, the expedition represented a massive undertaking involving the coordinated efforts of the Royal Navy, the East India Company, and numerous civilian contractors and suppliers, it was a testament to the administrative and naval capabilities of the British Empire, and set the stage for the complex and costly campaign that lay ahead. The voyage to China took approximately 3 months, with the expedition following established shipping routes through the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. During the voyage, British commanders used the time to study available intelligence about Chinese military capabilities and to develop tactical plans for the anticipated operations. One of the primary objectives of the expedition was to establish a naval blockade of Chinese ports, designed to pressure the Chinese government into negotiations while demonstrating British naval superiority. To achieve this objective, British commanders planned to occupy key strategic points along the Chinese coast, preventing the movement of goods and people in and out of the country. They also planned to conduct amphibious assaults on coastal fortifications and demonstrate their military superiority on land. Despite the challenges of coordinating such a large force across vast distances, British commanders were confident in their ability to execute their plans. They had benefited from decades of experience fighting against indigenous peoples in India and had studied Chinese military writings to understand their enemy's strengths and weaknesses. Moreover, the British had a significant advantage in naval power, which would be crucial for their success in the blockade of Chinese ports. The expedition carried with it not just military personnel and equipment, but also diplomatic representatives authorized to negotiate with Chinese authorities. The British government hoped that a show of force might persuade the Chinese to accept British demands without extensive military action. And the expedition was prepared to shift from military to diplomatic operations as circumstances required. The arrival of the British fleet off the coast of China in the summer of 1840 marked the beginning of a new era in world history. What followed was a series of events that would have profound implications for both nations and shape the future of Asia. The British Expeditionary Force began departing from British and Indian ports in April 18, with ships leaving at intervals over several weeks as preparations were completed and favorable weather conditions developed. The timing of the British expedition was crucial and reflected careful planning by British authorities in London, Calcutta, and other Asian ports. Ships assembled at predetermined rendezvous points such as Singapore and Hong Kong, where final preparations were made and last-minute intelligence was gathered about conditions in China. The British government understood the logistical challenges of coordinating such a large force across vast distances and through treacherous waters, so they made sure to plan ahead. From a modern perspective, the size of the force may seem modest, but by the standards of the time, the British expedition was truly impressive. At full strength, the force consisted of approximately 40 ships, including warships, troop transports, and merchant vessels chartered to carry supplies and equipment. These ships represented the peak of 19th century British naval power, including some of the fastest and most heavily armed vessels in the world. Among them were several steam-powered warships, which allowed the British to maintain a significant speed advantage over their Chinese counterparts. In terms of military personnel, the expedition carried around 4,000 troops, mostly British regulars and sepoys from the British East India Company's army. This included infantry, artillery, and a small number of cavalry, along with a few hundred Marines who were trained in amphibious warfare and would play a critical role in the British campaign. Additionally, the expedition carried several thousand support personnel, including sailors, camp followers, and civilian contractors who provided essential services and supplies to the military forces. Altogether, the expedition represented a massive undertaking involving the coordinated efforts of the Royal Navy, the East India Company, and numerous civilian contractors and suppliers. It was a testament to the administrative and naval capabilities of the British Empire, and set the stage for the complex and costly campaign that lay ahead. The voyage to China took approximately 3 months, with the expedition following established shipping routes through the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. During the voyage, British commanders used the time to study available intelligence about Chinese military capabilities and to develop tactical plans for the anticipated operations. One of the primary objectives of the expedition was to establish a naval blockade of Chinese ports, designed to pressure the Chinese government into negotiations while demonstrating British naval superiority. To achieve this objective, British commanders planned to occupy key strategic points along the Chinese coast, preventing the movement of goods and people in and out of the country. They also planned to conduct amphibious assaults on coastal fortifications and demonstrate their military superiority on land. Despite the challenges of coordinating such a large force across vast distances, British commanders were confident in their ability to execute their plans. They had benefited from decades of experience fighting against indigenous peoples in India, and had studied Chinese military writings to understand their enemy's strengths and weaknesses. Moreover, the British had a significant advantage in naval power, which would be crucial for their success in the blockade of Chinese ports. The expedition carried with it not just military personnel and equipment, but also diplomatic representatives authorized to negotiate with Chinese authorities. The British government hoped that a show of force might persuade the Chinese to accept British demands without extensive military action, and the expedition was prepared to shift from military to diplomatic operations as circumstances required. Coordination was key to the success of the British expedition, and it was made possible by a combination of advanced planning, efficient communication, and a high degree of cooperation between the various branches of the British government and the East India Company. Planning ahead allowed the British to prepare for the challenges of coordinating such a large force over vast distances. They carefully selected the timing of the expedition, taking into account factors such as weather conditions, availability of supplies, and the strategic situation in China. Communication was another critical element in the coordination of the expedition. The British government maintained a sophisticated system of communications that allowed for the rapid exchange of information between London, Calcutta, and other ports in Asia. They used a combination of sea and land-based communication methods, including signal flags, telegraphs, and couriers to keep all parties informed of the latest developments. Cooperation was also essential to the success of the expedition. The British military and naval forces worked closely with the East India Company to ensure that the necessary supplies and resources were available to support the expedition. Civilian contractors and suppliers also played a critical role in providing essential goods and services. Overall, the coordination of the British expedition was a remarkable achievement that reflected the strengths of the British Empire at its peak. Through careful planning, efficient communication, and close cooperation, the British were able to mount one of the largest and most ambitious military expeditions of its time, and set the stage for their confrontation with the Chinese Empire. Alright guys, that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment below about what you think of the video and what I should do next. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video!